Hello and welcome to our Brazil in Focus, a conversation on the economy and the road ahead. Bienvenue and bem-vindos. This is the first webinar of the BCCC Economic Fireside Chat series organized by the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, BCCC. I am Andrea Gardella, Chair of the Ottawa chapter and Resident Chief Economist of the BCCC, as well as the Director of Alcance Solutions. I want to thank our annual sponsors, Vale, Rio Tinto, Mellowhawk Logistics, Brookfield, BMA Law, and all our members and partners for their continued support. We are an independent, nonprofit organization that has promoted business relations between Brazil and Canada for over 50 years. At BCCC, we connect. Before we start, the BCCC Ottawa chapter acknowledges that the City of Ottawa stands on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. The Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples have lived and cared for this territory for millennia, and their culture and presence continue to sustain this land today. We honor the peoples and the land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, as well as all First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and all Indigenous peoples, recognizing their invaluable past and present contributions to this land known as Turtle Island. Together, we stand as leaders, embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We recognize that DEI is not just the right thing to do, but essential for our organization's success. We lead the change, understanding that diversity and inclusion practices must permeate all aspects of our business. By weaving DEI into the fabric of our organization, we cultivate an environment where every individual thrives and feels a sense of belonging, innovation flourishes, and collective potential is realized. Let us forge ahead, united in our mission to create a diverse and inclusive future and transcend boundaries and elevates us all. Now, let's get started with our inaugural Fireside Chat. Livio, you have your coffee. Welcome. So Brazil is once again at the center of global attention, but this time the convergence of forces feels, I would say, a bit different. From surging interest in our natural resource endowments to a shifting political landscape, Brazil is navigating a complex moment, while also balancing relationship between the world's two largest economies, the US and China. At the same time, Canada and Mercosur are accelerating negotiations to a potential trade agreement that could unlock meaningful new flows of trade and investment. We've heard it before, Brazil as the country of the future, but the real question now is, could this time be different? To try and answer this question, I am honored to invite fellow economist Livio Ribeiro, the founding partner of BRCG and associate researcher at FGV IBRE. Welcome, Livio. It's great to chat with you again.
Likewise, Andrea, thank you so much for the invitation. And I would like to thank BCCC for sponsoring and having this seminar with us.
Of course. Thank you so much, Livio. So Livio, let's jump right in. Let's unpack where Brazil stands, where it's headed next. I think starting with the big picture. If you had to describe Brazil's economy today versus 10 years ago, what would you say? And what are the nuances behind that?
That's a very good starting point, because 10 years ago, we were just in the middle, actually on the beginning of a very big recession. Okay, it is the largest by Republican standards in Brazil that trace back to the 19th century. Okay, economic historians in Brazil do have this, how can I say, this understanding that the recession that has happened by the end of Dilma Rousseff's term is the biggest ever in our Republican history. Well, from there to now, obviously, Brazil has improved a lot. Okay, but we are coming from the bottom. So on that sense, the only way was up. Okay, we had several institutional and economic reforms that were held by Michel Temer presidency just after Dilma Rousseff impeachment. And then later on, starting on Bolsonaro's term and going forward into Lula's term, I would say that we have stalled. Okay, so the current environment is much better than 10 years ago, than it was 10 years ago, though structural issues, which are quite relevant for an economy such as the Brazilian, are still in place. They're strongly in place. Nonetheless, the world has changed. And currently, in this specific juncture, it's reasonable to say that oddly, it has changed in a better way for Brazil, in a sense that we are commodity exporters, energy exporters. We are in Latin America, therefore, a bit away from the issues that have been held on the Middle East. And on this specific juncture, I would say that Brazil is a winner. Not necessarily on absolute terms. If we have a global recession, everyone will lose. But on relative terms, I would say that Brazil is far ahead than other big emerging countries.
I couldn't agree more, Livio, and you see it on the ground. I think there's a much different narrative around Brazil and how people are viewing Brazil, and its endowments in very different areas. I think are now much more front of mind than they used to be. Brazil is I would say the very popular kid on the playground right now, at least
Yes.
externally speaking. I would say so that's
Mhm.
where Brazil is standing today, and how we're coming into this next period. Elections often reshape expectations. They
Mhm.
lead to a pause in investment or trade decisions, out of concern that the environment will change. Since the last election, there's been a lot of discussion about policy direction. As you mentioned, things have kind of stalled. So, what has actually changed and what has remained fundamentally the same, whether on the good or the bad?
Okay, so the first thing that I would like to underpin is that, well, we have an issue here in terms of fiscal policy. Our fiscal policy is clearly unfeasible, I would say. Not on the long term, okay? If you're talking about the end of this decade, simulations show that our debt to GDP ratio would be as high as 100% of GDP. That's clearly not possible for a country with our wealth and a country with our broad economic structure. So it has to change. No, but what's the catch? It's hard to change that. Brazil is a very long-term work to build up a state that is far bigger than it should. Okay, so changing this mindset, not only within politicians, but for the whole society, it's quite hard. People are trying to bypass that by increasing taxes and tax revenues. But there's a certain threshold for that, and we're very close to it. So, in that sense, the general idea to have more expenditures, including social expenditures, which are very relevant in a place such as Brazil, which is very unequal, still very unequal. But funding those with higher and higher taxes, this is clearly an engine that is fated to be broken. Okay, and in the very short term, okay, that's the point. So this mindset has to change in the next presidential term. Either Flávio Bolsonaro or Lula, which are the runner-ups, will change that. No, they won't. So I truly don't know how we are going to translate it into, I would say, a new equilibrium, but that's not correct, into an equilibrium, because now we are not in equilibrium for sure. That said, there are things which help us a lot now, especially if you're talking about this general environment and how the external sector, the global investors see Brazil nowadays. And yes, we are the cutest kid on the block now. We are not very cute, okay? But now we are the cutest. And this is twofold. On one sense, obviously, this is good. Capital is flowing into our economy, FX is appreciating. We are having a broader sense of prosperity in a world that's highly uncertain. But in the other hand, this type of thing strips off the sense of urgency. Politicians, we like to say in Brazil that politicians do not care about interest rates. They actually do not care about inflation that much, but they do care about the FX rate. They understand that. And whenever you see the FX rate coming down for below five in relation to the US dollar, below R$ 5 to a dollar that has been happening over the last 10 days, the sense of urgency completely fades away. So what spooks me a bit is that we are going into a political cycle on which the economic agenda actually is not that relevant in terms of people voting for one or another, or in terms of building up the government and the society and the country for the next 5 to 10 years. People are much more concerned now, and they should be in a sense, about democracy, about institutional design, about how things will change or not given a certain president. Obviously, that's correct. We are seeing all over the world that some countries are going to dark paths, we may say, and people are worried in Brazil if we are going to do so. But oddly, some people think that the dark path is under Bolsonaro, and others think the dark path is under Lula. So this is a very polarized society. We are not on the middle now. And precisely on the middle is where politics happen. So what is happening actually in Brazil nowadays is that people are yelling to each other, but they are not talking. And whenever we don't talk, we can't make things go forward. I think that's the biggest issue and goes far beyond being the cutest kid on the block or no.
Well, I think it really goes to what can you do with that benefit of being the cutest kid at the block? Like, can you take advantage of the moment? And I think it does come at a very interesting time because there are elections, because it's two very polarized candidates that are coming up. And I think one question that comes up is because this is almost like a commodity super cycle 2.0 that we saw where Brazil benefited quite significantly back in the 2010s. Is it something similar happening now, or could we really be facing a true structural change with this election, with the current dynamics? What does that actually look like? What would it take to reach that structural point and see a true change in how Brazil manages the economy and takes advantage of the moment?
You see, I wouldn't say that this is a super cycle 2.0, okay? Why so? Back then, especially when we had the upcoming of China, we had persistent, I wouldn't say structural. Later on, we saw it was structural, but on the beginning, we saw it as a persistent shock, okay? You have short term, long term, and the medium term. The medium term is the persistent one. It was a persistent demand shock, positive demand shock. Okay. Nowadays, actually, what is happening is a negative supply shock. Okay. So, in structural terms, it shouldn't be structural in a sense, because either we are changing the whole economic equilibrium to another level, and therefore we have to think about all relative prices, all the math that we do for growth and so, or this is just a very, very big bump on the road. Okay, it could be so. So whenever I'm thinking about the current shock, I'm much more concerned about its persistency than its ability to change global structures. Okay, in the end, it could change global structures, but nowadays I can't say that. Therefore, I wouldn't put those two shocks on the same basket. Okay. That said, Brazil should hurry up. Why so? Because it should fade away on the medium to long term, 3, 4, 5 years. So the moment is quite now, and we have an election, and we have to understand what we will do to this bigger windfall, especially tax windfall and external sector exports windfall that we are receiving. I just can't see this discussion being held in the Brazilian economy as it should be, because people are still trying to understand if it's structural, if it's conjunctural. It's just a timely thing or so. So if I'm correct, and this is persistent, we do have revenues to take from it, okay? And that should change a bit our medium-term economic strategy, okay? But not structurally speaking. Okay? So I would say that it's kind of a silver lining, okay? A silver lining. We had a very tough moment ever since Trump administration 2.0 started, okay, for the whole world, not only for Brazil. Things were highly uncertainty, still are. Things have been changing a lot. They were highly volatile. And then now, this volatility has put Brazil and other Latin American countries, not only Brazil, but especially Brazil, in a better place, okay? But as it came, it could go. So we need to understand how to take best advantage of it. What has been happening currently? We are going in the opposite direction in terms of domestic economic policy. Why so? Because from one side, it increases revenues, it increases exports. On the other side, it increases inflation. And there's an election six months ahead. So the government is picking up this higher revenue and it's increasing expenditures in order to postpone inflationary effects on the Brazilian economy. Okay, that's correct. Okay, not only because we have an election, but because you have to you don't need necessarily to have a one-for-one pass-through on it. Okay, so as Brazil is a commodity and an energy exporter, it should use a bit of this increased revenue to make this passage, to bypass all the negative impacts into the society. But the catch is the election, you know. They could go much further than they should. So those things are ongoing, okay? So that's an issue on the short term to be aware of. The government is spooked, as it should be. Opposition is rising, as it should be. And in the end, it's all about presidential elections by the end of this year. Later on, we will discuss what to do with the country. But now it's about winning the election.
And getting us there as well. I think one of the things that I've always appreciated about our discussions, Livio, is that you've always been very good at distinguishing, in particular in the context of Brazil, which is I find sometimes that one of the misconceptions that there is a very distinctive difference between short-term and long-term in Brazil. You know, yes, there are short-term ups and downs, there's volatility. The FX is, of course, I think the question I get the most is what's happening with Brazil's FX. But then there's a very different story if you're looking at Brazil over the long term. Elections is where, yes, there is a bit of a bump. The current environment is different than it was back in the super cycle. I tend to see Brazil as having a bigger role economically, a bigger role geopolitically, whether it wants to or not. And so there's several things that I want to pull on, or strings I want to pull on from what you've just said. But I think one of the things that would be important to maybe start with is Brazil's growth story is not in isolation. It's not in its own. It's still it's a relatively closed economy, but it's still a very important trading economy. It's deeply tied to global demand and geopolitical alignment. Brazil sits at a really unique position between the United States and China. As an expert on Brazil and China, how do you see Brazil navigating the relationship today, and what does it mean on the ground for investors as they're not only looking at what decisions are to be made because of the elections, but also what decisions to be made because of what's happening geopolitically?
Okay, so some people here think, and abroad as well, that Brazilians' dependency on China is a fate. It is not, okay? We are highly complementary in terms of structural production, in terms of economic environment, in terms of what we have and what we need, and likewise in terms of China. Sadly, we are very far away from each other. Okay, but in the end, Brazil and China are some sort of the two sides of the same coin. Okay, and they are truly they are. On that sense, we have to understand that Brazil is one of the biggest battlefields of this opposition between United States and China, which is not an opposition of governments. People usually misunderstand that. They are opposition of states. They are opposition of economic and social and institutional ways to grow. Okay? You may talk about the Chinese way and the American way. I wouldn't put that precisely on those terms because there is no American or Chinese way on specific terms, but they are completely different strategies to increase well-being of their societies, the well-being of their societies. Then they are both very positive in a sense that they have worked quite well with all the ups and downs and so, but they have both worked quite well on both places. Okay, so on this geopolitical war that now is much more on dire straits, Brazil, as you said, has a unique position for the good and the bad. Okay, the best part of it is that we are on a very singular point to reap benefits from both sides. Okay, in terms of financial flows, in terms of economic flows, in terms of trade flows. Increasingly having more participation of Chinese companies in Brazil, doing what they did elsewhere. They start by investing on energy, then they change it a bit for agriculture and mining, and then they change it a bit for industrial production, looking for the domestic market and eventually trying to change that specific market into an export platform for Chinese goods produced overseas. That's precisely what they are doing in Brazil. They did a few things quite different here, especially in the financial sector. That's not very common, but they did over the years a lot of acquisitions or smaller banks in Brazil, and they have this, I would say, fingerprint here. Okay, but we are in the Americas. We are on the sphere of economic and political influence of US, for sure. Therefore, those forces will be clashing and still be clashing going forward. That's an issue, okay? Because on broader terms, Brazilian diplomacy is very neutral in a good way. We talk with everyone. We never get into conclusions, but on that sense, this is good. Okay, on this specific juncture, this is good. It puts us in a position to talk with everyone. I have a few doubts in terms of what will be happening on that in a new Bolsonaro term, because if you look to the previous Bolsonaro term, those are different Bolsonaros, but in the end, they should not be quite different. We had the Brazilian diplomacy much more aligned to US than it should, given Chinese importance in Brazil. So, on that sense, it eventually would open a window for other countries to get into the Brazilian market, as China is doing now, in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of financial flows, in terms of putting their footprints here. But on the other hand, that will, how can I say, change a bit our relationship with China, as it did in the first Bolsonaro term. Okay, so broadly speaking, Lula would be more pro-China, but not necessarily aligned to China. Okay, and Bolsonaro would be much more aligned to US, but not necessarily much more pro-US, because we can't just think that China does not exist. So we have to balance those things, and they are tough. Okay, but opportunities will arise, especially if each company in each sector understands how to navigate between those colliding forces between US and China within Brazil. That's not necessarily, Andrea, a conversation for this next presidential term. Okay, I would say that this is the conversation for the next 25, 30 years in Brazil, dependent of who is sitting on the presidential chair.
Yeah, it is a long-term strategy. I think most country, Canada is facing something very similar, where it's kind of confronted with a very changing global landscape, an approach to diplomacy that is, I think, also shifting. I
Mhm.
think Brazil and Canada have very similarities. I mean, Brazil is significantly larger and more populated than Canada, but there's a lot of similarities. And I'm curious, what does this mean for other international players that want to enter Brazil? What are some of the maybe the blind spots that investors might have looking at Brazil that are not from Brazil, not Chinese or not US, where you already have quite a big and a
Mhm.
heavy presence, but what about Canada? What advice would you give Canadian investors coming into Brazil given the current environment?
You see, I like to say that Brazil is the quintessential ESG player because we do have the environment, we do have social, and we do have government. Okay, so whenever you think about economic transition, green energy, rare earths, energy in a broad sense, including oil, Brazil is very well suited to be a workhorse going forward. Okay, so um, obviously it depends on which sector are you talking about, and depends if you are uh, stepping on the foot of an American or a Chinese company. Okay, it happens a lot, and that's very important to bear in mind. Though there are things which are kind of immune to cyclical political issues. Okay, and whenever you think going forward, Brazil will produce more oil. It will. Brazil has an immense biodiversity. Nowadays, this is biological wealth. People are still not very familiar with that, but actually, we do not have rainforests. We have huge surplus of biological wealth standing just there to be explored. Okay, explored in a good way, not to destroy the forest, but to use the forest as a mean of well-being, a mean of revenue for the Brazilian society. So all those things should be treated properly. Um, and once again, I'm not talking about the end of the decade. I'm talking about 25, 30 years from now. Okay. But Brazil, as many of you know, is a very tough regulatory, governmental, and economic environment. So you have to understand which are the loopholes, which is the necessity to have a global and a local partner, because getting into Brazil with a foreign mindset usually gets you into ruin. That's for sure. Chinese companies understood that. If you go back like 20, 15 years ago, they were coming to invest in Brazil, trying to do things on the Chinese way. Obviously, it didn't happen. So nowadays, they are we like to say they are more tropicalized. They understood that things are done here on a very different fashion, not necessarily bad or good, just different. And you have to play along. Otherwise, you'll be on the sidewalk. So, on broad terms, the biggest, I would say, recommendation that I would give is that do not come to Brazil with foreign eyes. I know it's tough, okay, but you have to bear that in mind in order to fulfill all your expectations and the revenues and profits here.
I admit that I've heard that feedback several times. I would say over the last 6 to 12 months, not from you specifically, Livio, and not to me personally, but as an advice to anyone entering the market. I think there's maybe a misconception that that money will talk and that you can get an investment in and things will move smoothly if you know the right person. But I think it's a multi-layered approach for Brazil. It's a long-term approach for Brazil. And it is one that has to consider the Brazil perspective and the way that Brazil does business. I think there, a lot of the risks that we talk about of doing business in Brazil that are very micro and macroeconomic, that are policy based, become a lot less of an impact on business if you're able to navigate the
Hmm.
market in the right way with the right partners and with a partnership mindset. I think that is one of the things I've heard quite a bit is to enter the market as a with a partnership mindset versus a seller of a good and then
Hmm.
we sell and then we leave. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And given all the flows that are coming into Brazil right now, Canada can't afford to not take a more Brazil focused approach when looking at the market. And you can always reach out to Livio for some local help in that perspective of trying to understand the market a lot better. Of course, here at the BCCC and Alcance as well, but local partners are always very well regarded and appreciated. I do want to remind our audience, do submit your questions. We will enter a Q&A session in the next 10 or so, 15 minutes. So do put in some questions in there. Otherwise, I will be selfish and I will keep asking Livio my personal interest questions. And one of the questions I have, and you somewhat touched on it, and I want to check if there is anything else that you would speak of. Brazil's a major agriculture economy, a major mining economy, um, a major energy economy. Uh, what are maybe the next, let's say the next generation industries that could really make Brazil a global player in some of these industries? Is this the bioeconomy one of those? Is there something that's also creeping up that you're seeing? Wow, that's we're seeing some shifts in some of the industrial bases in Brazil. I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing.
Yeah, there's something that I always like to pinpoint whenever talking about that. In Brazil, we had two, really two, um, how can I say, how can I say, I'm losing the English word for, I would say strategies, okay? Two
Hmm.
big strategies that came along between the academia, the government, and private players, okay?
Hmm.
The first one was aviation industry.
Hmm.
Embraer, ITA, which is probably the best university in Brazil, and then leading to a global player, as you know, Embraer is nowadays. At first, as a state-driven company, and then later privatized and being a global player. There is another story similar to this, which is the Embrapa story,
Hmm.
which is a think tank for agricultural studies in Brazil, state-backed, very important on Brazilian academic universities that has held several studies and several innovations which are being used nowadays in the Brazilian countryside. And a lot of our higher productivity, such as in corn, wheat, soybeans, came from those innovations that were at first discussed and then tried upon over Embrapa. But we still do not have proper private companies which are
Hmm.
gaining benefits and profits from it. You have the big players on the countryside, okay, but they are not precisely industries. They are much more close to farmers, and there is a transition between those two things from specifically farmers into global players within the food market. We do have JBS, we do have Sadia, BRF nowadays, we do have Minerva, but they are much more related to specific markets, beef, pork, eventually soybeans, than really a structural, an environment, a cluster of agribusiness in Brazil. The agribusiness Brazil is not precisely a business. They are farmers, huge farmers, but they are farmers. Canada has done that with canola and so. And eventually, we could think things that, once again, in terms of partnerships, that could use Brazilian productivity, Brazilian landscape, Brazilian soil, Brazilian sun, with the Canadian perspective to build up companies which profit from those things. I think it's very clear, okay? We do have big players, but there is no cluster of it. So we should have. And whenever we talk about energy nowadays in Brazil, we are still thinking too much about oil. But energy should be seen in a broader perspective. You see, all big players on the energy sector, on the oil sector, elsewhere, are turning into energy companies. They are not oil producers, they are energy producers. Petrobras is a bit far ahead on that. So I would say that there is space to understand this broad picture as the Brazil being not only oil superpower, as it should be in 5 to 10 years, but as an energy superpower, because we have hydro, we have solar, we have wind, we have them all, especially the green energies. So once again, people tend to use the ESG agenda in Brazil to greenwash things, okay? But if you think about the structure of the Brazilian economy, our endowments and so, we are really the ESG player. We just have to take this path and unlock its potential, this potential. But the potential is quite clear, it's there.
I appreciate you touching on this idea of commercial, like scale and commercializing. I think, next week there's actually a delegation from Brazil coming to one of the biggest food and agriculture shows here in Canada that's coming from Brazil, showcasing a group of Brazilian companies that have grown to be experts in certain products that Canada doesn't have a whole lot of access to. And so I think these types of initiatives where you're seeing whether it be trade missions, collaboration. We would love to have a collaboration with Embrapa, for example, to build out and co-innovate on different agriculture products to take advantage of the lessons that Brazil has built out for itself. And so I think it's interesting between Canada and Brazil because there are we work in a lot of the same industries. We're major players in a lot of the same industries, but we bring different strengths to those industries.
Yes.
And I think there's such an opportunity to build bridges between us and to leverage each other's knowledge. And on our end, we're quite good at developing startups and getting them to the commercial stage. But then that scale is a challenge here, save for, of course, a few industries where we've been quite successful. But there's also that ecosystem in Brazil that I find extremely fascinating. These hub clusters. Like aerospace, you spoke of aerospace with Embraer, with ITA, with PIT out in São José dos Campos. You have these clusters of industry, academia, and support through these hubs that are growing these major companies. But more of that could be done, and it could be done internationally as well. I think there's just so many industries of potential in both cases, and I think there's just a lot more to do. Now, one of the questions I've gotten throughout our chat that is somewhat related to each other is more on the practical terms. We are a business, let's say, wanting to enter the Brazilian market. from a structural perspective, what are some of the barriers that Brazil has, ingrained in in the way that it does business that is maybe hampering some of the investment flows into Brazil? Is there a sense that those might or might not be improved? And what would those kind of major barriers be that you would say working with investors, looking at the Brazilian market more broadly?
Nowadays, I would say that we are just in the beginning of a very important change in our tax structure. Okay,
Hmm.
it's starting next year, and it will be at least we think it will be completed by 2032. 5 years of change. Okay, from this current tax structure to a new, much closer to the VAT taxes that we have elsewhere. But how will play, how things will play
Hmm.
within this time frame, we don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Eventually, people ask me, and as Andrea knows, here at BCCC, we have a bit of, how can I say, contact with
Hmm.
from companies in the real sector from foreign countries, such as not only Canada but European Union and Japan, especially. And the thing that people ask me most is
Hmm.
which are the taxes that I'm going to pay in a time frame of 5 to 10 years in order to see if the investment will be profitable or no. And my honest answer is that I don't know my taxes. How would I know your taxes? Okay, this transition is very tough. Okay, so in the sense, you have to put a discount on its price.
Hmm.
So whenever thinking about Brazil, we do have to have that in mind. You have to work with a discount rate. If the FX rate is strengthening as it is, this discount should be higher. Okay. And there are several opportunities on those sectors that we are talking about. And several opportunities also on Brazilian financial markets, which are quite deep. People do not realize that, but likely Brazilian financial market is the deepest on the Southern Hemisphere. It's bigger than eventually the Australian market. Okay, highly technical, highly sophisticated, and going. It's very innovative because it's very tough to make money whenever you have your treasury bills running at 15%. So people here have to innovate. They do. Uh, those things, which usually are not spoken of, are quite relevant. For instance, in terms of financial intermediation, in terms of technology, we do have peaks in Brazil that basically does not happen anywhere on this scale. Okay, this is a public infrastructure, a public technology, but a lot of players, private players in Brazil, know how to use it. And then eventually merging that with financial payment systems elsewhere, or merging that with blockchain and crypto assets could be something to look forward and to dig into. Okay, people tend to joke that in US we have the GDP now, which should be the timely transaction between foreign financial institutions. It's so lazy that people call it GDP yesterday. It takes so long, and we have an infrastructure here in Brazil that it's like those things that you see on videos and so about China. People do not use bank bills in China anymore. Likewise in Brazil, people. I don't remember the last time I saw a banking bill. Okay. So we are an emerging country, but if you look at specific places, we are highly competitive, highly innovative, and very developed, including more developed than developed countries, such in this case specifically, US and Canada. So why not think about those things? I'm giving here hints, okay? But there are some things that are quite obvious: mining, energy, food, and so, and things that are not obvious: financial intermediation, internet technology, and so, payment technology. So you should have a broader perspective in terms of the Brazilian economy. We are really big. We are a huge demand market, one of the biggest in the world, likely the fifth or the sixth biggest in the world. And despite all the jitters, despite all the issues that we are a developing country. We have been growing, we have been surviving, and we are getting wealthier. So we do some things quite well, and that's the point.
I'm glad you brought up picks. I think that's one of the, if I were to pick one innovation from Brazil to bring to Canada, it would be picks. It is incredibly impressive how quickly it was developed, how quickly it was adopted, and
Mhm.
how broadly it is now adopted. I think I may be the only person in Brazil walking around with reais in dollar bills because every time I get asked to pay in Pix and I don't have a Pix account, so I should probably get on that. But I think there is. I'm glad you brought up the topic of technology because this is one area that Canada has significant strengths in artificial intelligence, for example, in quantum computing. I'm curious to know how the economy is the Brazilian economy. It started to incorporate it in the financial sector. And I'm curious to know how industry more broadly is looking at AI, how the economy is integrating it into different industries or how it does business. How are you seeing AI taking a role in the Brazilian economy?
So especially on the financial top markets, people are starting to incorporate it. But I would say it's more a hype than a trend, at least for now. Okay. Uh, some newcomers are totally built up upon AI. So teams that like 2, 3 years ago would have 15, 20 specialists nowadays have 5. Okay. Uh, this is translating, at least as far as I can see, into the factory's grounds. No, at least not now. But if you go to the big ones, Embraer, for instance, or the auto industry in Brazil, they have been designing cars using CFD and artificial intelligence for quite some time. But they are talking about those things and not putting the terms artificial intelligence, but they were actually. Okay. So there's huge way to increase implementation of AI technologies in Brazil. People usually, if you go to the streets and talk about AI, people will talk about ChatGPT as a bigger Google, but it's not, okay? And people are not quite aware of their potentials, and they are not quite aware of what they can do just prompting with plain Portuguese, okay? Why so? Uh, I would say that that's an issue here. Our education, our broader level of education is lame. Okay, I can't put on other words. Brazil, if you think about, and that worries me a lot. If you think about uh, scholar years, not quality, okay, I'm talking about quantity, I'm talking about volumes, and you pick up the biggest, the latest and biggest survey for Latin America, which was held in 2018, so it's a bit old. But if you get that, Brazil is behind Bolivia. It shouldn't be. Okay, Argentina is much more ahead. That not necessarily translates into quality, and that's not necessarily translates into wealth or economic power. Though, if there is a handicap on education, likely the adoption of artificial intelligence won't be as high as it should be. Okay, it's not a coincidence that the biggest adopter in the world is Israel. because they are highly educated, they are very tiny, and they have to do much more with much less. Once again, Brazilian is big. We are big, a huge society, a huge country, and there is this sense of abundancy that makes us structurally not to have urgency. And then why adopt AI if I don't have to run, if I don't have to be more productive? So there is this mismatch, okay? For sure there is. But once again, on specific markets, which are have to be very competitive, very innovative, such as the financial markets, those things are exponential.
And I'm hearing a lot too that well, I mean, PIX was driven by the central bank. It was a public policy. Government is also moving to a system where it's quite digital, like its digital infrastructure is growing quite significantly, uh, which brings up a lot of compliance and regulatory questions to that. But it seems that maybe on the industry side, selective industries are much more advanced and will leverage AI, and they will face their own, I guess, compliance and regulatory challenges. But in other areas, I think we're still taking baby steps
Yes.
In advancing some of these areas. But I do appreciate that Brazil, on the topic of AI, on the topic of data privacy and data protection, it's taking a very advanced approach of how to deal with these issues just because just the sheer size of the population, the amount of data that's being shared on a constant basis is something that certainly could be an area of collaboration with Canada to kind of learn how Brazil has been able to integrate this issue. So we're getting to the end soon, and I have one question that's kind of come up a few times in the chat, and then I'm going to reformulate if the audience allows me to, is, if you were a small to medium-sized Canadian company trying to enter the Brazilian market, what advice would you give it? What are some of the key pieces of information that they should know, whether it be economic variables or economic policy or more broadly, that you would give a small to medium-sized company going into industry X?
I'm gonna. It's a joke, okay, but I think you have to hire 3 consultants: an economist, an accountant, and a lawyer. Okay, precisely that. Okay, why so? Because in the end, those 3 things come along in Brazil. Our tax structure is bizarre. There is no other way to put it. It's a jungle. Okay. Depending on which state you are with the current tax environment, you pay different taxes doing precisely the same thing. Okay. And eventually, if you change from one state to another, you have a tax refund that should be collected, but not necessarily will happen. So you have to have a lawyer to go into it. And Brazil is very diverse, okay? And Brazil, in a sense, is very specific. As huge countries are, if you're thinking about an investment in our region here in the Southeast, the reality is completely different from the South, completely different from the Center East or the Northeast or the North of the country. So that happens a lot in the US as well. If you're thinking about California, British Columbia is in Canada. If you think about California, if you think about Nebraska, if you're thinking about Boston, those are 3 different countries, and it happens a lot here as well. So you have to understand which are the strengths of your product, your services for the Brazilian economy as a whole, and specifically for where are you going into the Brazilian economy, because it changes a lot. There are a lot of regional preferences, structural issues, specific issues that can change your math. You need to understand our tax structure, our legal structure. If you happen to understand Brazilian tax and legal structure, please let me know. I would like to understand it as well. It's tough as hell, okay? But it's how you do business in Brazil. And you have to realize that in Brazil, there was a saying from a past finance minister in Brazil that said that in Brazil, the past is uncertain. That's completely sure. Things change backwards, okay? And you have to realize that in order to make business here, okay? I'm not talking about specific sectors. I'm not talking about an industry or a product. I'm talking about the general landscape, the environment that you have to operate to be in Brazil. We have those things. Some of them are very good. Some of them are not. But you have to shape yourself to our needs, I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Economist, accountant, lawyer. Don't let that stop you or scare you from entering the Brazilian market, because if you enter with an open mind and an informed position, it's a huge market of opportunity, and the BCCC is there to help to try and build those bridges. But I think that's fantastic advice. A huge market of opportunity. I will ask my last question selfishly. It's something that I will be asking all of our invitees, and I've started to do that with a few articles that we've written on LinkedIn. But what is a book or a podcast that you've come across recently that's kind of either changed your ideas or really contributed to something important to you right now?
In terms of Brazil or broadly?
Broadly.
You see, I have been studying a lot nowadays the change in political structures happening elsewhere, not only in
Mm,
Brazil, and how they are shaping our societies going forward. Because the world has been like on a swing
mhm,
between the progressive left and the right wing, which is not necessarily the far right, okay, but the liberal right, we may say so. And there is a book here in Brazil that applies quite well for that. There actually is a series of books. It's called The Country of the Privileges,
mm,
okay? País dos Privilégios. It's written by a journalist called Bruno Carrasa. And in terms of the Brazilian societies, it's quite important to understand that, because there's a general sense of unease, we can say, with how
mhm,
things have been done in Brazil for quite some time, and that passes through this idea that you have. It's not obviously it's not a very equal society, but there is like different types of societies, and there are some people which are more close, I would say, which are closer to the judiciary sector, so the government as a whole, which are seen as having privileges.
mm,
And that is shaping how people will vote.
mm,
Okay. There is a narrative going on that we have to change it all. How so, people don't know. But you see, whenever people are uneasy, whenever people are scared, whenever people are angry, you open up space for the messiahs,
mhm,
people that say that will change it all, but they actually do not state how they will change it.
mhm.
And in order to understand what has to be changed, we have to understand what has to be changed. So I've been studying that quite a lot, and I think this book, those series of books actually, they are quite relevant to understand how the state structure in Brazil has changed and evolved over the year to protect itself. And I
Mm.
think it's very, very important to understand the needs of our society, at least on a broad perspective, and how people will vote, not only in the presidential election, but all in the elections going forward, in terms of this strange and not necessarily calibrated needs of change.
I I so appreciate that your suggestion was more of a political scientist
Yeah.
perspective of Brazil, because you really can't separate the politics from the economics in Brazil. If there is ever a case, that would be the one. Livio, thank you so much. We've come to our time, unfortunately, and so on behalf of the BCCC, I want to thank you, Livio. I want to thank our sponsors, partners, and members. This event was one of the many that the BCCC organizes to promote connections between Brazil and Canada. Please visit our website and social media channels for more information on upcoming initiatives such as the BCCC Power Tech Roundtable in 2026. The series continues, and so stay tuned on the BCCC's website for the next iteration in June. We also offer membership and sponsorship opportunities where you'll gain visibility, networking opportunities on all of our events. Thank you again for joining us today, and count on the BCCC to expand your network in Brazil and Canada. Ciao, ciao, everyone.
Bye bye.